It is my great pleasure to introduce Wendell Wallach, an ethicist from Yale University. Not one of the typical people we have coming to visit the laboratory. So Wendell is a consultant and scholar at the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics at Yale. He's also a senior advisor at the Hastings Center, a fellow at the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law, a member of many councils and advisory panels, too many to list. Wendell has an international reputation as an expert on ethical and governance matters, especially associated with emerging technologies, which is a large part of why he is here. He is a published author. Last couple books are A Dangerous Master, How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control, and most recently, Moral Machines, Teaching Robots Right from Wrong. He is interviewed by many of the leading news organizations, quoted widely in the press. I won't say wildly in the press, or perhaps wildly as well. He's appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, BBC, PBS, both MSNBC and Fox, so he is actually bipartisan. And today he's going to be speaking on Agile and Comprehensive Governance of AI and Synthetic Biology. Wendell, take it away.
Thank you very much, Fred. I've had the opportunity to speak in a lot of pretty cool places, but I was just thinking, of all of them, my father, who was a scientist and a doctor, he would have thought this was the coolest. If you just listen to the techno-optimists, you would think that we were on a highway to heaven on earth and the buses are speeding up at an exponential pace. On the other hand, if you listen to the techno-pessimists, we're clearly going straight to hell in a handbasket. But most of us, and I'm pretty sure that includes everybody in this room, perceives scientific inquiry and technological innovation as a source of both promise and productivity. And yet there is a degree of disquiet, as evidenced in the worldwide prohibition on human cloning, concerns around human growth hormones in sports. The EU has its ongoing debate about genetically modified foods, and in the US we debated embryonic stem cell research. And then there's these ongoing issues of biosecurity, infosecurity, and the toxicity of nanoparticles. I think self-driving cars actually give us a pretty good metaphor for what we're dealing with. Technology is moving into the driver's seat as a primary determinant of human destiny. And there is even the melodramatic possibility that we have begun inventing the human species as we know it out of existence. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit initially just about emerging technologies, and then I'm going to focus on some concerns arising with AI and in synthetic biology, and then we'll finish up with some more in-depth discussion proposals for ethical legal oversight. In my most recent book, I think Fred got actually the book switched. The more recent one is A Dangerous Master, How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. The title came from a quote from a 1920s Norwegian peace activist, Christian Los Lunga, who said that technology is a good servant, but a dangerous master. And I juxtaposed that with a quote from Professor Owen Corey, who said, if we keep going in the direction we're headed, we better change direction soon if we don't want to end up where we're headed. So the basic idea here is we need a bit of a course adjustment. And A Dangerous Master was largely a primer on the emerging technologies, so a little bit of science, a little bit of history, a bit on the benefits, but what I really underscore is what can go wrong as we tap into new technologies and how, as we are busily reaping the benefits, and there certainly are endless benefits, how we can mitigate the harms or societal consequences that are undesirable, and how we can mitigate those through ethics and engineering and oversight. There are, of course, many emerging technologies, many ways to parse them. I just happen to like breaking them down into these three groups: biotechnologies and physical and material sciences and information sciences. And most of the audiences I talk with Even the scientists probably couldn't define all of the topics on the screen, but that may be a little bit different here because I understand you're more interdisciplinary or more transdisciplinary is a word I like even better. But of course, there's 9 categories here, and we are in the age, even in this post-Letterman age, every list has to have 10. And the 10th is really the convergence of all these areas of research. So a true, well, we're imagining things like a true nanomachine, which would actually be quite a bit smaller than this one, since I believe when we're talking about blood corpuscles, we're on the micron scale of roughly 3 microns. So we're at least talking about a magnitude of 1 to 3, less than that if we're talking about nanomachines. But we're already imagining little nanomachines that have DNA attached to them, or a DNA or a virus attached to them that could be delivered to the location of a cancer cell and presumably alter those cancer cells. DNA is only 2.5 nanometers wide, so all of this is conceivable on the nanoscale, and we might even have chemical processes that are providing engine for the nanomachine, and perhaps even computer linkages that would allow some external control over navigation. But all of that's still pretty fanciful from where we are, but quite conceivable given the many research trajectories going on now. Some of the characteristics of emerging technologies is that they're developing extremely fast. It's highly uncertain what the benefits, risks, and trajectories will be. Many of the concerns fall outside of traditional regulatory agencies, and there's a multitude of applications, a multitude of industries, a multitude of concerns, potential regulators, stakeholders, and standards proposals and programs involved. Most of you have, of course, heard of, and I presume some of you have some expertise in deep learning, which has revolutionized AI. Artificial intelligence, since it was first coined in 1955 in an advertisement for a small little conference that took place at Dartmouth in 1956. Artificial intelligence has gone through what are sometimes referred to as summers and winters. Summers when you have a new strategy, such as neural networks, and winters when the neural networks don't prove to deliver very much for long periods of time, and almost died out as a strategy, but has come back with a roar in what you might call the global summer or the global warming summer of artificial intelligence, when deep learning networks are giving us the capacity to input massive databases and have outputs that show us salient relationships within those databases. But in spite of the fact that we have a robot that was recently given citizenship by Saudi Arabia, Sophia from David Hanson's laboratory, it's pretty limited what kinds of artificial intelligence we have. Actually, I was in the room when Sophie was standing there. It was a room in Riyadh, had about 35 trillion of the roughly 120 to 30 trillion of investment capital represented in that room. And the first thing out of her mouth was, "I just love being with rich, smart people." So no wonder they gave her citizenship, regardless of the fact that much brighter women and others in Saudi Arabia don't have the same kinds of rights that were granted to Sophia. But whereby deep learning has helped us solve the problem of perception, there are many other cognitive faculties that really still lie on the horizon, and some may even pose thresholds that we can't crack. We really don't know at this stage, but there's common sense, planning, working with analogies, reasoning, language, emotional intelligence, consciousness, all kinds of cognitive capabilities that we really don't know how to reproduce at this point in artificial intelligence. Though Gary Marcus has proposed that we make common sense reasoning a crash program, and I just saw in the newspaper today that the Allen Laboratory is taking that on as one of their next projects. When you think of governance or oversight or concerns, there's a plethora of them for artificial intelligence, from safety and security and technological unemployment, data ownership, transparency, existential risk. This is just a partial list, but when you start to think that artificial intelligence will be utilized for nearly every conceivable facet of society, we're talking about the whole plethora of ethical concerns coming into play. The big three are superintelligence, the weaponization of artificial intelligence, and technological unemployment. Superintelligence is still pretty speculative, but it's the one that gets an awful lot of press, particularly with people like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Stephen Hawking waving the flag. But probably weaponized AI is the bigger concern when you think of lethal autonomous weapons and cybersecurity and weaponized narratives. Technological unemployment, well, perhaps technology will destroy more jobs than it creates, but that's not as much a scientific problem as it is a problem of political economy. How are we going to manage our societies if work's no longer the form in which people get goods and services? But there are more immediate concerns, and that's that learning algorithms aren't transparent. We have the input, we get the output, we don't know how that was arrived at. And suddenly we're becoming really concerned about algorithmic bias. The old adage, garbage in, garbage out, still holds true. And we know that the massive databases that we're feeding into these systems carry all the human biases that belong to the humans who corrected the data, and those biases are revealed in the output. So how are we going to manage that? And then there are issues around data privacy, the ownership of data, the responsibility of those who own data to the users. And now we have from the EU the GDPR, which is a new data rights program that is not only demanding that algorithms can explain themselves, which is clearly not possible with the black box kind of deep learning algorithms we have, and that humans have the right to opt out from data collection. Is this even possible or conceivable in the modern age? But these rights are being granted. I think they go into effect in August of this year. So everybody's scurrying around to see whether they can meet those concerns. I'm just going to talk about one area in, what shall I say, in confidentiality or just revealing where I stand. I'd like to talk just for a moment about lethal autonomous weapons. Is this a good idea or a recipe for future disasters? As many of you know, there have been meetings under the auspices of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in Geneva over the last 4 years about whether we should have a treaty to restrict the deployment of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And there is a worldwide movement to ban killer robots, a term that, of course, the arms negotiators hate. But the movement folks feel that that is helping them reach the public because they know they need a lot of public support for this to take place. I'm among those who have testified at CCW, and I've testified largely about the predictability of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I've argued that machines must not make decisions that result in the death of humans. That, in fact, such systems should be considered mala in se. Now, for those of you who don't know that term, it's an ancient Roman term that says something is evil in and of itself. And rape is an example of an activity that would be considered mala in se. And machines making such decisions are not mala in se because they're machines, but because they're unpredictable, they can't be fully controlled, and attribution of responsibility is difficult, if not impossible. So my argument is that we need not only just meaningful control, but real-time meaningful control over the actual selection and destruction of targets or killing of targets, if that's what we're doing. And partially my reason for putting it in this form is there are endless, interminable circular debates about when a machine is really autonomous and when it isn't. And those debates have obfuscated being able to even vote on whether there should be restrictions on lethal autonomous weapons. And the point I'm trying to make is if we put in place a higher order principle, then we can at least make it clear what's unacceptable. And then we can go into these debates, which will go on forever, about when a machine is actually autonomous and when it's just an extension of human will and intention. Now, I know everybody in this room may not agree with me, and this is a pretty complicated conversation like any kind of arms control conversation gets, but there's a lot of nuances in it. But basically, I think we should declare that lethal autonomous weapons, if they are picking the targets and dispatching without meaningful human control, that they actually violate existing international humanitarian law, the existing laws of armed conflict, and that's what we need to clarify. But what concerns me even more than lethal autonomous weapons, which I think of as really just the tip of the iceberg, is that increasingly autonomous robotic systems, they're threatening to undermine the foundational principle that a human agent, either individual or corporate, is responsible and potentially accountable and liable for the harms caused by the deployment of any technology. My biggest fear is that we start delegating responsibility to machines for activities for which they just don't have the intelligence to be performing. Synthetic biology and genomics in general, I mean, we've been talking about the issues around genomics for a few decades now, ever since Dolly was cloned. But the big news recently is CRISPR-Cas9, and actually Cas9 is not the only CRISPR, there are other CRISPRs. But what that has done is speeded up gene editing from a matter of months and years to a matter of hours. I even know of high school students who are engaged in gene editing now with CRISPR-Cas9. So this means that the likelihood of confronting all of the ethical issues that have surrounded genomics, they're coming fast and furious. I'm not going to go through all of those, but I do want to mention one, which is gene drives. Now, CRISPR-Cas9 is enabling a form of gene drives, and what gene drives really do is allow one to bypass normal inheritance and go into a form of inheritance where you can wipe out one variation of a species and substitute it with other variations. And this has become particularly attractive when you talk about wiping out the mosquitoes that carry yellow fever or Zika, one variety, or the mosquitoes that carry malaria, a different variety, and is heavily being researched for both of those purposes. And there are many other purposes where you could create a gene drive that would wipe out other species that become quite compelling. Think of locusts that swarm. They swarm actually over 47 countries in the world. And we're talking about billions of crops being destroyed. Well, you could create a form of locust that did not swarm. And that would seem to be a very compelling species. But when you talk about introducing such a locust into so many different ecosystems, you don't actually know whether that one feature may actually be entangled with other features, or it in and of itself could lead to the collapse of that ecosystem. And God knows we will have engineered organisms that could lead to the collapse of more important ecosystems, often for frivolous reasons. There's nothing to stop us from introducing species that could actually wipe out other species. And the difficulty is, how are we going to oversee this? Can we put effective testing in place before the deployment? What happens if a species just escapes from the laboratory? And we're talking about altering any environment, including your microbiome, including your digestive tract and the thousands of different bacteria that inhabit that actually contribute significantly to our well-being, though some are pathogenic. So when you start to think of governance for these areas, well, what would be an ideal governance system? These are some of the terms that come up, that it would be nimble or agile, adaptive, credible, function as a good faith broker, be participatory participatory, have multi-stakeholder input, be comprehensive, be coordinated. Sound like any government you know of on this planet? That's the difficulty, isn't it? And furthermore, there is a fundamental mismatch between the speed of scientific discovery and technological innovation and our ability to keep up with it. There's a growing gap between emerging technologies and their legal ethical oversight. And that gap is often referred to as the pacing problem. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, good. Now, no trouble at all. There are other limitations of traditional high law regulation, laws and regulatory agencies. Many risks or concerns are outside of the agency's jurisdictions. Which agency is going to deal with technological unemployment, existential risks, algorithmic biases? At this point, it's not really clear that that would fall within any agency. And furthermore, our agencies get so piecemeal and our regulations are so piecemeal that oftentimes you find one area being distributed across many agencies, and they don't necessarily coordinate with each other or cooperate with each other. So it might be beneficial to have a more holistic approach that integrates all applications, risks, and stakeholders, particularly when we're talking about biotechnologies and artificial intelligence. So rather than all these little horizontal regulations, we start to, vertical regulations, each functioning in their own silos, we at least have somebody that starts to look at all of this horizontally or comprehensively. Well, Gary Marchant, the director of the Center for Law and Innovation at the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State University, he and I were sitting down over a cup of coffee and lamenting how incredibly impossible it was to regulate technologies given the existing kind of governance structures we have when we decided to turn the question 180 degrees. And we said, well, if we had our druthers, what would we put in place? And what we came up with is what we refer to as governance coordinating committees. The basic idea is that you put a body in place that functions as an issues manager or orchestra conductor, and also for the public functions as a good faith broker. That's easier said than done, but we need something like that, and I have a feeling we're going to have more conversations about that later today. But it would coordinate the activities of the stakeholders, underscore best practices, and engage in comprehensive monitoring, flagging issues and gaps, and trying to find solutions to those issues within a robust set of available mechanisms. And it would be mandated to avoid regulation wherever possible. That regulation is the last resort. But how would it do this? Well, if it came up with a gap that needed to be addressed, what would be among the robust set of mechanisms? Well, first it should look at whether there are mechanisms within ethics and engineering. Technologists like to talk, particularly here in California, all of the libertarians like to talk all the time about techno-solutions. So let's look at which of the technological solutions are truly feasible. Not just the fanciful ones, but the ones that are truly feasible. And there are other forms of engineering. There's value-added design, where you bring in privacy, responsibility, transparency, other values as design features for the technologies themselves. Here, safety is clearly a bottom-line design feature for so many of the technologies that you're dealing with. You can also look at social engineering. You could look at whether we can upgrade corporate oversight. And some recommendations in artificial intelligence would be to have AI technical review boards and AI ethics officers. So the review boards would be constantly looking at the technologies being developed by a corporation and thinking through what could go wrong or what would be the societal impact, and the AI ethics officer hopefully would have the clout that they could bring that to the attention of management. And then the next level, and perhaps the most important level, would be soft law or soft governance. Now, that's probably a new term for most people in this room, but it refers to industry standards, laboratory practices and procedures, insurance codes, a whole plethora of different mechanisms we have that actually can be used to manage behavior and safety. And then as a last resort, we would look at hard law, regulations and regulatory agencies and treaties and verification regimes. Now, soft law itself also has its own limitations. There's no assurance of participation or compliance. Since anyone can create a soft law program, there can be a proliferation of different programs. They may overlap, they may be redundant, or there may be conflicts between them. And perhaps most importantly, the public has reduced confidence in soft law programs versus traditional government regulation. Though it's not clear that the public has much faith in government regulation now anymore either. So the strength of soft law in comparison to government's programs is it can be very agile. You can throw out a standard or a law when the technology supersedes it. Today we have all kinds of laws and regulations that are largely obsolete because the science has gone way beyond what we were dealing with initially. It took a few decades for TSCA, the Toxic Substance Act, to catch up with the fact of nanoparticles, because when it looked at poisons, it was looking at PCBs. It was looking at poisons that existed in these vast quantities, not even thinking that you might have a little vial of nano poison that could poison a whole reservoir. There are some forms of soft law enforcement, either direct or indirect. So perhaps ISO 9000 would be one familiar to most of the people in this room. These are the standards that have to be met if you're going to sell to government contractors or many of the larger industries. It doesn't stop a smaller company from not following ISO 9000, but it basically means if you want to grow and be significant, you really do have to follow those standards. Liability insurance is more and more demanding that certain standards be met before you can get the liability insurance. There are funding agencies that are requiring compliance before you get funded. We have institutional review boards and other mechanisms out there that are part private, part governmental. But what might be necessary here is a totally new role for government. If governments could understand that they cannot keep pace with scientific discovery, perhaps they can turn over that role more to the standard-setting bodies, but they can help put in place mechanisms to enforce violations of soft law, of the standards. We actually have precedents for this already in the common law, but we also have agencies like the Federal Trade Commission that are quite capable of prosecuting somebody for what they perceive as violations of public trust. So in effect, what we're saying here is, can governments move into a role where they give more enforcement clout to the standards created by industry or scientific bodies or other standard-setting bodies, and not expect that they're going to keep pace with all of these issues and concerns. Now, any new mechanism, any new body, it's going to have all kinds of implementation challenges. If you put a new, let's say, NGO in place, would it have adequate authority and legitimacy? Would its influence be adequate? How would you select the members or administrators? How would it establish credibility? Particularly important if you wanted to function as a good faith broker. Should it be governmental or should it be private or some kind of combination of the two? How would it be funded? To whom would it be accountable? Given the present political climate, many of you may be thinking, this is just too complicated or hopelessly naive. And no doubt there's a few of you in this audience think that this is both too complicated and hopelessly naive. Nevertheless, we do need something like this. We do need something like this, or we are opening the door to losing control of scientific development. Oh, I lost that last slide. But I'll just, rather than go back, because we need something like this, Gary and I had proposed pilot projects in artificial intelligence, robotics, and genomic synthetic biology. So largely artificial intelligence and synthetic biology. And we proposed those pilot projects because at this point, both of those fields are largely unencumbered by regulations, and the standards have not been fully set. So in effect, we might be able to grow new bodies as these standards were coming into being and put some degree of coordination in place with the development of the standards. And in that regard, it's not enough to do this in the United States. In fact, a concern that I started to develop was if you start out with bodies like this in the United States and Europe, there's no guarantee you're going to get the Chinese, the Russians, the Arab world to buy in. So I have proposed that we start with simultaneously an international body and complementary national bodies, whichever ones you can get started at roughly the same time. And we call this the Building Agile and Comprehensive Global Infrastructure for the Oversight of AI and Robotics. I'm hoping one can be started up for synthetic biology also, but my personal network is stronger in artificial intelligence, and therefore I think I'm in a better position to catalyze that. But we are definitely in conversation with people who have much more clout within the biotechnology world. Now, central to anybody you start, whether it's international or national, is that it's in support of the other groups entering this space, in a cooperative support, not in a competitive role. So we already have so many other bodies jumping into this realm internationally and regionally. You have the UN, you have the World Economic Forum, you have bodies like the International Committee of the Red Cross, the European Union, and of course we have the standard-setting bodies, the IEEE and the ISO have been jumping in. We have industry-promoted consortiums, such as the Partnership in AI. We have research centers. So the challenge is that you have a body that's in cooperation, supporting, and if it's going to underscore best practices, it's taking those best practices from other players. If it's looking for solutions to problems, it's first looking to see whether some of the other players in the space have come up with some solutions that have actually got some degree of demonstrability of working. Each of the other bodies is really sensitive to competition and usurpation of authority. So essential here is that that's not what you're trying to do. You're just trying to bring some horizontal oversight in place, not just vertical oversight. And finally, and fundamentally, you need to be focused on outcomes, not merely process. What I have described here is an initial framework for a process. But that process is only as good as it helps us in moving ahead some real outcomes. So in that regard, I put out a call for a Global Governance Congress, and I think it's important that it not be in Europe or America. And I'm already in conversation with the UAE, with Singapore, and there's even some investors in Hong Kong that might actually host this event. So we'll see how that all moves along. And the agenda for this Congress would be first to try and establish or set in place standards for algorithmic bias, for transparency, for data integrity, and ownership. Hopefully by the time we have a Congress, best practices, some solid standards will have come to the fore. So this is largely about endorsing or conglomerating the different standards that do come to the fore. And it becomes important in so many respects. Think of most of the countries in the world. They are not in the position to create their own standards. They don't have the economic clout. It would be nice if they had a body to go to who said, well, these are established as best practices, and we will work together with you to try and customize those best practices for your culture. And for other international bodies, we're going to need standards for those countries that don't even have functional governments. We've got a good number of those countries in the world right now. But and when I talk about setting standards, here's just basically what I mean. If you can't ensure the transparency of an algorithm, what application should you just not deploy that kind of technology for? If you can't assure the transparency of a deep learning algorithm, and you don't at least have the capacity to engage in forensic analysis after the fact, should a tragedy arise, you should not be deploying that for a high-impact application. But there are other applications which, regardless of what the EU says, you don't really care about transparency. If I'm looking at a massive liver data about liver disease, and I'm a researcher, I don't care whether the algorithm can explain to me what it did. All I want to do is see what salient relationships it's highlighted at the end, and whether they might be one or two I'd never considered, so that I can develop an experiment to test those. But then there's that middle ground. I'll come back in a moment. Then there's that middle ground of applications where we may need to put in testing and compliance standards before you can deploy for those applications. But the second agenda here for our governance structure would be to set up the governance structure itself, or for our Congress, excuse me, I don't mean for the governance structure. For the Congress would to see if we could put in place an NGO that developed along with the industry and became an oversight body. An oversight body not just to help industry and governments along, but also hopefully to function as a communicator to the public to say, these technologies are either being developed safely, or in some areas they are not being developed safely. So technologies are developing at a rapid rate. You know as well as I do. I mean, a lot of what I was underscoring here was what's developed since my book came out 2.5 years ago. My book doesn't even mention CRISPR-Cas9. And deep learning was just coming to the fore when I was writing it. So I got to put a few pieces about it in when the proofs came back to me from my publisher. We are in a hothouse. We get time largely because a lot of the science is revealing that everything's just 10 times more complicated than we ever thought it was. So even though the science is moving along quickly, we don't have to deal with issues like superintelligence and a lot of the other more fanciful and speculative things at this time. Or if we do, we're dealing with them in the form of thinking more about AI safety than AI theorists had ever been doing up to this point, when they were so caught up in thinking of the functionality of their systems. But if technological development is accelerating as it appears to be, then the need for foresight and planning becomes truly pressing. So thank you very much.